If you've made it this whole season and you still think that that other generation is the problem, have you actually been listening? Because you've completely missed the point. Listen, I know none of you are that dense, and I know that you're here to understand a bit more about why we even have this friction in the workplace. So, what we understand is that the generations were never the problem. If you've been following this season, you understand that by now, right? That really they're more so just the evidence of what's actually going wrong in the workplace. We've started to thread this needle of what the gaps are in the workplace around trust, right? And building that trust within our environments. The gaps that might exist in our different leadership experiences. How about the miscommunications that are on a regular day-to-day basis? That this is people are speaking the same, they want the same thing, but they're speaking different dialects, right? Maybe different languages. We've identified that accountability, even change management, is also to influencing how people are showing up differently in the workplace. Blaming the generations is easy, but leaning in and leading the humans is actually much harder. So, welcome to the Generational Edge with Kristina Green podcast. And I am Kristina Green, your generational translator. In this final episode of our first season, our inaugural season, we're making it all make sense, right? This season was never about proving which generation got it right. We weren't keeping track, keeping score of who's doing what to whom. This was more so about understanding and exposing what happens when we hide behind these generational labels. And we use that to avoid having the honest conversations about how people are really experiencing the workplace. Now, let's get into it. We use generational labels to, I don't know, give us a simple explanation, right? Or more like a generalization around each generation. You've heard this before, right? So, boomers are just resistant to change. And Gen X is just cynical. Well, there may be some truth to that. Just kidding. Millennials are entitled. And how about this one? Gen Z is just way too sensitive. Now, if you've heard the lyric, all good jokes contain true sugar honey iced tea, we understand that these didn't just come out of nowhere, right? We understand that there is some presence in the generation that's making this seem or ring true. But when we hold on to those labels, we're not allowing ourselves to do the work that's really necessary to get over it because none of that stuff is productive. None of it is constructive. None of it gets us to where we want to be. Because beneath the surface, right, if we actually start doing some of the work that's necessary, what we recognize what's really at play here is that trust is what's a problem. Communication is a problem. Manager capability and how it is that we are preparing and leading and giving resources to our managers to be effective is a problem. That the workload that we're assigning within our teams, that we're delegating and expecting from people is a problem. That the development that we are either not providing for our teams collectively, or that we're completely missing the mark on sharing with some versus others, gatekeeping that development, that is a problem. And the accountability. Oh my goodness. Accountability is one of my biggest values, core values, and I refuse to let that one go. It's understanding that we all have an accountability and responsibility to one another, right? And especially as leaders, that is a problem. When we have a lack of that in the workplace, that is an issue. And change management, how we are managing people through the changes that are they are experiencing in the workplace, all of these are problems. And if we keep putting a label on things, on the generations, then we are avoiding asking the right questions or better questions. Like, what is the behavior that we're experiencing that maybe we're frustrated with? What is it actually in response to? Across this season, we've been talking about many different topics, and while they may have been varied, the pattern and the themes have been the same. For example, we understood that return to the office was not about getting people into four walls. It was about exposing the trust and control issues that we might have as leaders over whether or not our teams can execute, whether or not they can do so without our micromanagement or managing every step of the way. We also learned that work ethic is not dead. It's just this definition of what commitment looks like is different now, right? It looks different across each generation. We learned that side hustles are not a sign of disloyalty. Instead, it's actually more of a reflection of the financial issues and pressures that your teams are experiencing. That it's expensive as hell to live today, and I'm just speaking for the US, right? Cost of groceries, cost of living all around just to breathe seems to cost money every single day, right? It also too was a reflection of maybe the ambition that they have internally. Listen, if you think that your people are working, that your employees love the work that they do. Now, there are some people who go to work every day and they are so blessed by the work that they get to be part of. But understand something, that is not the majority of us. The majority of us are working for a paycheck because we want to live, right? So they may have other ambitions to start a business and stop getting on their case about it, right? If they can figure out a way to be professional while managing that one, their number one responsibility with you, while also to building and growing a personal brand or another business. We all know that we can't survive just on one revenue stream these days. Side hustles might also too be communicating their lack in the faith of their employers. There's been a lot of layoffs, and so people are trying to figure out contingency plans. You can't blame them for getting there, for trying to be proactive in controlling their lives. No one wants to be living reactively to what might happen and most likely could, because and how fast technology is turning over these days. We also talked about how corporate parenting is actually exposing what happens when leaders confuse control with development. Just because you're controlling the how people are moving through their work, their day to day, does not mean that you're developing them, does not mean that you are giving them opportunities to develop, especially not if you are managing every single step of the process, right? We also talked about how this concept of or the assumption around change or resistance to that change, you might be overlooking the grief that is involved with that change, right? The uncertainty of the unknown, especially when we talk about mergers and acquisitions. People are now blending families, if you will. So what's going to happen to my position? What's going to happen to my role, my contribution into this organization? Work that I have learned to enjoy, right? So there's a sense of grief in grieving of what they thought was to come, right? And also too, there's this broken trust. The trust that's been damaged because when we don't manage how change is communicated effectively, then that can break the trust not only with your teams, but also too with just within your organization, your reputation within the community or the industry that you are serving. We also too talked about that panic in the workplace can lead different generation to respond to that very differently, right? So we all know that some just because something is perceived to be emergent or urgent doesn't actually make it so. And so every generation responds differently to that stress, and we've got to be open to understanding what that looks like. We also talked about how authenticity actually exposes that tension between this concept of professionalism and censorship, right? So how it is are we expecting people to fit into a box, right? How they are to dress, how they are to style their hair, how they whether or not they wear makeup, whether they're not they how they present themselves when they are in a meeting, when they're in a presentation. All of these things can lead to judgments or requirements or criteria that can start to feel a bit more like censorship, especially if we have a bias towards what professionalism actually looks like. And that's a conversation for another day. And then we also talked about how AI can give you an opportunity when you're rolling out new tech, when you're rolling out an adoption of different AI capabilities. This can give you an opportunity to bring your teams together, to collaborate more, right? To give them a sense of belonging by having a central guideline, if you will, or a practice of experimentation around adopting or choosing not to adopt new tech. And we also talked about how Gen Z is actually bringing voice to many of the workplace patterns that we've all just been tolerating for a long time. So they are the canary in the coal mine. They are the whistleblower, if you will, for things that we have wished would change for decades, but we've just dealt with forever. So, and now since they're bringing voice to it, now all of a sudden they're the problem. No, they are exposing the issues that we have been uncomfortable with and have been dealing with forever. The issue was rarely, if ever, the generation, right? That's the theme that we've spoken about this season. It has usually been related to how these generations are showing up in this space has given us an opportunity to now start having a conversation around what the future of work looks like. Every generation demonstrates different behaviors in the workplace based on what they've inherited or maybe even what they've experienced. And they respond to the feeling of being threatened or feeling threatened or uncertain in the workplace by clinging to different things that they protect that matter most to them. For example, the stability, right? Being able to understand or count on the idea that they have a job tomorrow or that they have a sense of how their day will go tomorrow, today, right? Have some sense of control over what that looks like. An authority to be able to make decisions, to be able to guide the work instead of having to check with someone all the time, or this sense of independence instead of always leaning into a collaborative space where we have to make decisions based on, a committee's approval, but they have some sense of autonomy with doing some of that work. They have the flexibility of how on the execution, on how it is that they're going to get us from A to B, get to the end result. And maybe the sense of like financial security. As I mentioned, none of us are working because we just love the work that we do, right? If we were independently wealthy, you wouldn't even see us on your admin line, period, right? So, this concept of creating this stability, there's nothing wrong with that. So, they start to lean in and to protect those things when they start to feel uncertain of what the future looks like. We know that the different generations are not always fighting for different things. They're just protecting the same need, but they're using different language to do it. And that is when the translation, with understanding the different generations, why that matters is because different generations are going to protect different things, but different people will also protect different things depending on their personalities. Now, accountability does not fall to one generation over the other, right? It is absolutely shared. The answer is not for organizations to lean in and to accommodate one preference over another or for even all preferences. No, we still have a business to run. The answer is neither for the employees to accept outdated practices without asking any questions, without understanding context, without challenging the things that we should be considering to change, right? Leaders have still have to own the clear expectations and the communication of those expectations, right? What does success actually look like? Having the accountability to your teams to be able to define that, help them to understand what they're shooting towards, to be able to provide consistent decisions instead of choosing one or the other. One person gets one response while another gets something different, right? That is favoritism. They also have to own honest communication. So when it's time to provide feedback, when it's time to be honest about whether or not we were successful, or even to give someone the praise that they deserve for being successful, right? Honest communication. Leaders also have to own a framework that better prepares their managers for leading the teams that they are responsible for. Leaders also have to own that trust building is required before they can start to lean into an expectation of their teams being loyal. Trust is earned, not just given. And employees, equally accountable on the other side of that coin, regardless of your generation, they've got to own professional communication. And this concept of professionalism is defined by your organization, right? What is considered to be professional where you are, right? How to fall in line while not necessarily losing who you are, but also to not demanding that change happen simply because you operate differently. Employees must also be reliable. Give your leaders a sense of security in knowing that they can count on you, that you will deliver, not only in the deliverables that you have and that you'll execute them, but also too in your ability to show up and be present, right? So not only to show up on time, but to be present during meetings, during conversations, to provide contribution. They can rely on you to be a presence during the discussions, to have a contribution, right? But also to have to be open to feedback because not all feedback is going to be great, right? We're not here to just kiss each other's butts and tell them that you're doing great. We have to also have conversations around where there were gaps, where we have opportunities. Everyone has opportunities. So you've got to be open to hearing the feedback so we can grow together. Employees must also have this respect for the different work styles. So listen, if you are new in the workplace or if you are experienced in the workplace, everyone is showing up a little differently. And not everyone has to just bend to the way that you do things, right? So if this tension exists in your workplace, have the conversation about how we can do things better, how we can be more communicative, how you can use language, how you can use different communication formats in order to support the success that you're looking for. Not everyone works the same. Not everyone is going to pick up the phone. Not everyone is going to respond immediately to an email or a Slack message, right? Not everyone wants to be in a meeting where three people are talking and 10 people are just the audience, right? So have a conversation about what that looks like when it comes to managing the different work styles. Every employee also needs to be responsible for their own development. Your employer is not responsible for developing every aspect of how you want to grow, right? So within the content of your role, sure, right? There's some level of responsibility there. But to be honest, you were hired to do a job, not necessarily to be mentored to the next step. That comes with establishing rapport and leaning in and provide and being all of these other things, being reliable, being open to feedback, being collaborative with your teammates. It's mutually your responsibility to develop yourself as well. And employees must also have the ability to disagree without dehumanizing one another. Not every event or statement is worth canceling someone over. Not everything that is happening in the workplace is actually toxic behavior. Some of it is just learned adaptation of outdated outdated process, right? And have a conversation. So instead of escalating to the next level, why not have a conversation about why do we do that? Because they might even ask you, I have no idea. It's just what we've always done. So it's what I do. Do you have suggestions about how we could fix it? You see how that leads to a different conversation, an opportunity instead of a judgment. Goal is to not make every generation work the same. Instead, it's to make sure that the difference between our different work styles doesn't lead to our dysfunction, lead to an HR escalation, right? A cancellation of an entire organization simply because of a miscommunication. So much of what we experience as a generational conflict in the workplace is really more about who gets to define what professional is, what's committed, what respectful, and what's even expected. That label or that authority in the workplace is really what drives many of these conversations. And when you isolate that to one generation over another, or prioritize it to be favorites or to play favoritism to one generation or another, you end up excluding other voices that need to be heard in that space. The future of work is not about building based on one generation winning or not, because then we all lose in that scenario. Instead, it's built on leaders who can create an environment of trust without demanding blind loyalty, who can be open to feedback, who can be part of a collaborative environment, and recognizing that just because we are where we are today based on where we were yesterday does not mean that we don't have an opportunity to continue to grow moving forward. It's also built on employees being flexible enough with how they grow so they can be part of the solution. So the next time that you hear yourself saying that that generation just doesn't get it, right? They're just out of touch, or they're just too sensitive, or what is with all of this expectation? They're so entitled to think that they deserve that. All of these things should, instead of leading that direction, and if you've been paying attention this season, then the theme is that we don't lean into our assumptions. Instead of saying that generation just doesn't get it, I want you to ask yourself this question instead. What could you both do differently to get a different result? And I'll leave you with this quote from a great friend of mine who says, "It is better to understand than it is to be understood," which is a spinoff of Stephen Covey's quote that says, "Seek first to understand, then to be understood." Now, you've been listening to the Generational Edge with Christina Green podcast, and thank you for being part of our inaugural season. Like, share, subscribe, do all the things, because generational friction isn't going anywhere. And guess what? Neither am I. We'll be back next season. Might change the format a little bit because I want to start to hear from you all. I want to have the generations weigh in on what's actually happening in the wild, right? Work is a mess. Work's going to be what it is. But let's have some honest conversation about how the generations are showing up in your day to day personal lives, because we all know none of us go to work without carrying the baggage from our day to day. In the meantime, have a great summer. Take care. See you next time.